I've moved a lot growing up, that by the time freshman year of high school came around, I had moved 7 or so times and was about a year and a half into my most recent move. I had found a pretty close group of friends in my middle school, and we all went to high school together. Sam, I met through one of those close friends, and they were in a band together. And even though he was almost 4 years older than us, we still welcomed him into our group. Sam was easily twice my size, tall and heavy-set, and originally kind of intimidating, although I was never afraid of large men before him. Lesson learned. Now my home life wasn't great, so I spent as much time at school as I could, sometimes hanging around campus until 6 or 7 at night with my friends. 3 of us lived in the same direction, so we would walk the half-an-hour trip together until our paths split. On one particularly colder evening, Sam offered to walk me home since the others had gone home already. I just thought he was being a gentleman. He mentioned something from when he'd lived in California about a friend that he'd wished he'd walked home. Because he hadn't, something terrible had happened. We left it at that, and I let him walk me home. After that night we became closer. We'd bonded over both having lived in California and exchanged numbers. He would message me late into the night about his depression and that he self-harms, and I just wanted to help. A few months later he tried asking me out officially. It was a big romantic gesture that he'd put together. He'd learned a Disney song on the ukulele and sang to me in the school cafeteria. But unfortunately for him, I was already dating someone. When I'd turned him down, he became very angry, and freaky, quiet, twitchy kind of angry. I felt so bad. From that point on, I started seeing him everywhere. We were still friends and we hung out in the same group as always, but when I would pass him in the street, a few minutes later he would change direction and start following me. He would walk me to classes by following me in passing period at a distance. I started to minimize the group time we spent together, but he would follow me more. I had friends meet me at each class, so I wasn't alone walking to the next one. I felt really unsafe now, and he knew where I lived. Then he started to talk. Not to me, though, to mutual friends about that one girl in California who he didn't walk home. At first, she just shared the same name as me by some crazy coincidence. Then she had the same brown curly hair and blue eyes, and every time he rambled about her, she became more and more like he was describing me, explaining in more detail of what happened. Over literally weeks, this fantasy evolved into him walking her home and being jumped by some guy with a knife. It was her birthday, the 24th of January, my birthday, and she'd died horribly because he couldn't react in time, and she bled out in his arms. Sarah, who has the same brown curly hair, blue eyes, my name, my birthday, and sounds just like me, bled out in his arms. Each retelling of this story had more and more detail added to it, and this guy with his sick fantasy about my death would follow me around and knew where I lived. Now, my boyfriend was abusive, mentally and physically, but I stayed close to him whenever I could. Because if Sam had tried anything, I knew for sure that he would throw a punch. I never felt safe at school or walking around our little town. One day at school, he just had a breakdown. He freaked out and ran out of the school in a panic. I was sent after him, and when I found him, he was curled up on the floor. I got closer, knowing about his anxiety and depression, and pushing my safety aside, I just wanted to make sure he was okay. It was then he told me, adding more detail, the story that he had been telling everyone else. He and this girl had been walking home from a concert in California when they passed a dark alley and a homeless man suddenly jumped out with a rusty knife and demanded anything valuable that we had on us. He fumbled for his phone, but didn't have anything else on him. The man thought Sam was going to call the cops, so he stabbed him. He stabbed him once, twice, and again and again. At this point Sam saw red and picked up a broken bottle that was nearby and attacked the man, killing him with his own knife. At that moment he confessed that he'd killed someone. My stalker is a murderer. It didn't matter how messed up he was anymore, and I didn't care if what he was saying was fantasy or real. I also didn't care how it would affect his mental health. I just wanted to go to the police about this, as I was scared for my life. My friends advised and convinced me to go to the school counselor first. So that morning we went and told them everything. The stalking, the stories, and how he just confessed to murder, and that was the reason for moving away from California. Also how I was afraid for my life, and I wanted to go to the police. But the counselor didn't take us seriously. She called in the principal, who by the way isn't a mental health expert, and called Sam in to talk about the accusations. The principal then informed me that he did not think that Sam had any kind of mental illness, or that I was in any danger, and that was that. I lost faith in adults after that day, and I gave up on going to the police. I stayed close to my friends, with them always walking with me between classes, and also hiding behind my abusive boyfriend. I looked behind me every step I took that year. The school counselors ended up gaslighting us, to the point where this all just feels like a fever dream now, and I would think it was all made up, if it wasn't for my journal entries recording the events, plus the growing panic and similar accounts made by my friends. Just to clarify any confusion, I don't think anyone actually did die in California. I think he's just a pathological liar, and that he was so deep in the fantasy that he had convinced himself that it was all real. No, I wasn't harmed physically, but the emotional scarring and threat that he posed was 100% real. I'm a French girl. I'm 25 years old, but I was 22 when it happened, which was 3 years ago. I was living with my then boyfriend in a little flat in Paris. It was a toxic and violent relationship. Also on top, I was suffering from a disease that meant I couldn't go out with friends, so I ended up spending most of my free time on the internet. I didn't have many friends either, so I was really lonely, especially as I couldn't go out, and most of them had abandoned me when I fell sick. The few real friends that I had were living really far away. One day I had a really big argument with my boyfriend, and I was feeling more sad and lonely than usual, so I decided to have a chat with random people on a website. I met a guy on there, and we had the same interests. We both liked to play video games a lot, and we talked every day for 6 months. He knew that I was in a relationship, even if it was a horrible one. Let's call this guy Alex. Alex and I eventually decided to meet in real life, and he was okay to meet me at my flat. At first we were both really shy, but thanks to alcohol we ended up talking and laughing together. I was so relieved to finally have a friend to talk with, and we were now seeing each other every week. I remembered this as a really happy time in my life. We had so much in common, and he never forced me to go out. He was actually really helping me, and I was helping him, as he was depressed. He'd been thinking that he was ruining his own life, so I wanted to help him as much as I could to give him self-esteem, and I just wanted to spend time with a good friend. For my 22nd birthday, my boyfriend decided to throw me a party, and he invited Alex, as he was the only friend that I had who was living close by. My boyfriend invited 10 of his friends too, but I wasn't very happy about that. He knew full well that I didn't like to be around too many people, as it tends to make me anxious and feel under pressure. I spent most of the party cooking, preparing and serving food for all his friends, and I couldn't enjoy myself. Then, to top it all off, my boyfriend humiliated me in front of everyone. I ran to the bathroom crying, and Alex joined me, trying his best to comfort me. I was in complete mental breakdown, and I told him everything about my boyfriend's behaviour. I insisted on the fact that I loved him, but I will break up with him when it felt like the right time, as it was too dangerous to do it now. Suddenly, still crying, Alex tried to kiss me. I abruptly stopped him and said that I didn't want to add any more complications to my life. It was far too difficult already. I know that it's weird to say, but when he did this I felt betrayed by him. It was like he was waiting for this moment to try something on. He didn't react. He just opened the door and gave me a gift. It was a really beautiful necklace. I told him that I couldn't accept it, as it looked way too expensive. He didn't say a word and just left. After the party, I decided to put some distance between us. I didn't want to make him suffer, as it was cruel to keep him as a friend if he wanted more. I explained to him that if he wanted more from a relationship, then it wasn't going to be with me. I didn't want to cheat on my boyfriend, but if one day he wanted to talk to me as a friend, that he could contact me. But I didn't hear from him after that. A few months later, I received a number of texts from him. They were really long, and they said things like he was really in love with me, that he wanted to save me, and that I was his reason to live. I was shocked at first, because of the way he'd said it. It was really creepy. I explained to him one more time that I didn't need to be saved, and that I was an adult. Even if my boyfriend was mean, I didn't want to break up with him. I told him I wasn't feeling ready for any of this, and that I wasn't in love with him. We exchanged texts like this for over an hour, but he didn't want to understand what I was saying. Alex was very insistent, and I was now receiving too many texts and phone calls from him. It was making me really anxious, so I decided to turn off my phone and go to work. At this time I was working in a little restaurant. I was a waitress, and that day I was taking orders by phone. The phone rang, and I picked it up, but instead of it being an order, I could hear breathing. I soon recognized who it was. It was Alex. I felt like I was in some horror movie. My body froze in fear and I began to shake. I hung up almost immediately, but then the phone rang again. It rang over and over again, something like 10 times, until eventually my boss picked it up. It was only 7 p.m, and I was supposed to be there until midnight. 11 p.m. rolled around, and that's when I saw him. He'd come to my workplace and begged me to talk. I was so afraid I couldn't speak a word. I ran into the kitchen and explained the situation to one of my co-workers. He took my place as waiter, and I his as cook. Alex left 30 minutes later, and by the time my shift was over, I was too afraid to go home alone, so my co-worker dropped me off at my flat. Now my boyfriend was a night shift worker, so I was completely alone. I locked my flat door, blocked Alex's number, and I was getting ready to call the cops. I didn't want to talk about it to my boyfriend, as I already knew that he wouldn't help me, and he would just accuse me of encouraging him. Moreover, I didn't want him to get into a fight with Alex. Alex, to me, was just lost. He was scaring me, but he didn't deserve to be beaten up. The next day when I turned my phone back on, I had more than 100 blocked calls. I wasn't sleeping at all, and I was exhausted. I was trying not to give him any attention. 1 month passed, and he'd tried to come to my workplace many times, but my boss talked to him and ended up calling the cops. He never came back there again, but he was still harassing me. I ignored him as much as I could, and thought that he'd understand and finally leave me alone. I was so afraid that I tried to log a complaint with the police, but they just said it was a guy who's in love. One day I woke up to go to work. My boyfriend was playing online video games, and he received a message. It was from Alex. It read that he was in love with me, that we'd had sex many times, and that I was cheating on him. I was so shocked that I couldn't understand what was happening. My brain froze and I couldn't react. but thank goodness my boyfriend had seen a blocked call from Alex, so he suspected that he had been harassing me for a long time, even if I'd never told him. He decided to block him too, then he went to work. My boss then called me and told me that I could start a couple of hours later today. I was now alone at my flat, and I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like something bad was going to happen. My heart was racing, and I was feeling nauseous. Then I heard my doorbell. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 10 times. I couldn't stand up to walk. My body was completely frozen in fear. I could feel tears on my face, but I couldn't react. I felt like I was in a nightmare. I waited, trying to be as silent as possible. As he had been stalking me for a long time, he knew that I was supposed to be at work by now, so I figured that he'd wanted to see my boyfriend to try to manipulate him again. As he wanted me to be single, he probably thought that that was the best way to do it. The doorbell rang again. I was supposed to be going to work soon. I mustered all the courage I had and I went to the door. It was him, and he was crying. Right then I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. I began to shout at him as he tried to explain how he was so in love with me and how he would die if I didn't give him a chance. He said that he'd talked to my boyfriend, and he was finally going to save me. He said that even if I didn't want to be with him, my boyfriend would kill him so he wouldn't be suffering anymore. He also admitted that he'd hacked my Facebook and Instagram accounts so that he knew I wasn't hating him. He'd read conversations that I'd had with friends about the situation, and that I'd said that Alex was just unstable, not mean, and that I was more sad than angry about his behavior. I decided to make a run for it, but he was able to grab my arms when I'd gotten to the stairs. I hit him, begging him to let me go, and I cried like I'd never cried in my whole life. I was terrorized, angry, and I just wanted to escape and run as far away as possible. He pushed me against a door and told me, "If you refuse to have a conversation with me, I'll go to your boyfriend's workplace. I will talk to him. Then he will hate you as much as I love you. Maybe he will even kill me, but that doesn't matter." I was trapped. I couldn't escape. I didn't want to call the cops as they hadn't helped me at first, so I saw my only choice was to give in and talk to him outside my workplace after my shift. He calmed down instantly, thanked me and left. When I arrived to work, I was still shaking. I explained everything to my co-worker and boss. My co-worker decided to stay in his car after work, in front of the restaurant, so that if I needed help, he would be there. At the end of my shift, Alex had arrived. We sat outside and talked, and all he did was repeat what he'd said to me before, over and over again. Then I interrupted him calmly and said that nothing will ever happen between us, that I was afraid of him, and that he was poisoning my life. Moreover, he was putting me in danger. He stopped then, and it looked like he'd finally realized what he was doing. He then pulled something out of his bag. It was a really big package. He gave it to me, and as I opened it, I could see that it was full of expensive items. I told him that I didn't want to accept it. He first told me that he'd bought this for me so he couldn't keep it, as it will be a reminder. But then he kind of blackmailed me by saying that if I accepted this, then he wouldn't contact me ever again. I just accepted it. I was tired and just wanted to go home and finally sleep. He said goodbye and then left. Sadly though, that's not the end of the story. 2 weeks later, I was sleeping at one of my co-workers' places, who had become a really close friend of mine. At around 5 a.m, my phone started ringing. I was too tired to answer, but it kept ringing. It was some text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, the first thing I saw was blood. Then there was a long text, but I didn't have the time to read it as I was receiving more and more pictures. There was blood everywhere in these photos. Worried, I woke up my friend and showed her the messages. I was shaking so much I couldn't understand what was happening. I'd received 31 pictures of mutilated arms, torso and legs. The last photo I saw was of Alex's face. I called Alex's mother to explain to her what was happening and that I recognized his bedroom in the pictures. My friend then took the phone away from me and hugged me tight. I felt so guilty thinking that everything was my fault. Almost an hour later, I hadn't received any more texts or calls, which was making me even more anxious. I thought that he was dead. Suddenly my phone rang again, and it was a video of him in a hospital bed. He was trying to talk, but almost every word was muffled, except for the words love and promises. Alex had tried to commit suicide. He'd taken many drugs and cut himself up. He was diagnosed with a bipolar personality disorder and stayed a few months in a psychiatric clinic. The last thing I heard about him was that he was on treatment and is feeling better. I received a last text from him last year. All it read was, "Sorry." Since all this happened, I've moved to a different city, got a new job, a new house, and a new boyfriend. Even if I'm still traumatized, I do think that Alex is not the bad guy here. In France, psychiatric problems are taken too lightly. Alex just needed help, and I really hope from the bottom of my heart that he's feeling better now. I'm a 21-year-old male, and this experience happened last summer whilst on vacation at Myrtle Beach with my family. We were staying in a resort that was right on the beach, and we were on the 13th or 14th floor in a sort of timeshare property. One night I was feeling restless and having a hard time falling asleep, so at around 3 a.m. I decided to go out onto the balcony to get some air. I stepped out and was immediately stunned to see that there was a full moon, and the moonlight on the water was really beautiful. The beach was completely empty as far as I could see, and I had never seen it like that before. I decided since I wasn't able to sleep that I might as well head down, take a stroll, and listen to some music to relax, and hopefully when I'd returned I'd be able to get some sleep. It was really unsafe and dumb of me, but since it was 3 a.m. and the rest of my family was asleep, I decided to just head down without letting anyone know I was going, as I thought I'd just go and chill there for 10-15 minutes, then come right back up. So at the base of the timeshare we were in, there was an area with a pool, an outdoor bar, and then 2 boardwalks, separated by about 100 feet, which both led onto the beach. On the sides of the boardwalks, there were swaths of tall grass separating the ocean and the resort. When I got down to the base, the entire area was completely deserted, and I started walking down the boardwalk on the right towards the beach. As I was walking down, I suddenly saw someone approaching me from the beach, which was strange, because I had a pretty clear view of this same area from the balcony just before, and had literally seen no one. I started to get a bit nervous as I watched this figure approach, and as I got closer, I could see it was a man, maybe in his late 30s, who had a backpack on and was wearing glasses with large square lenses. Getting closer still, I got a clearer look at him, as the boardwalk is sort of illuminated by lights from the outdoor bar. He looked very on edge and alert, almost like he was trying to find someone who was meeting him in this area, and his clothes were somewhat tattered. We made eye contact for a brief moment, and I sort of nodded at him as we passed one another. At this point I'm creeped out, because to be honest, he had a sort of Jeffrey Dahmer look. Maybe it was the glasses, and he just didn't seem like he actually belonged to the timeshare resort. I shook it off and kept walking on down the beach, and put my headphones in. Getting closer to the beach, I took a right and started walking parallel to the water, just taking in the scenery. I'm barefoot and decided it'd be nice to walk just along the shoreline, so I moved in closer to the water and continued my stroll. After no longer than a minute, I began to get a really, really strange feeling that something was wrong. I took out my headphones and turned around, and I could see a dark figure trailing me just up the shore. He was situated in between me and the resort. I can immediately tell from the figure's height, body type, and demeanor that it is the same man that I'd passed on the boardwalk. At this point, I'm really starting to panic, as every story from Reddit's Let's Not Meet is rushing through my head. At the same time, I'm trying to rationalize what's going on too, as it feels too surreal that I may actually be in a dangerous situation. I remind myself that it could just be a coincidence, and the man was also taking a walk on the beach and just happened to be heading in the same direction as me. I took some deep breaths and turned my head back to the ocean and continued walking. After a couple of seconds, I turned my head back again and see that now he is much closer to me and is not walking parallel to me, but is definitely actually walking towards me. I picked up my speed now and turned my head back around to see he is matching my faster pace and is still walking towards me and the water. Still though, for some reason I think to myself, okay, maybe he also wants to walk by the water. There's no way I'm actually being followed by a creepy man on a deserted beach. So I decided at this point to truly test my theory. I needed to do a 180 and completely change my direction. And as I turn my head, I see him completely change directions with me and continue closing in the distance between us, power walking now towards me. It suddenly hits me that I'm in a real bad situation, and I start running alongside the water. But he started running as well. He stayed up shore of me so that if I tried to run up towards the boardwalk, he could intercept me. I'm totally freaking out now and just kept running with no plan. But I figured that since I'm 20 and sort of fit, I should probably be able to keep running along the water and outrun him, then find some other exit off the beach, and either call my family or head back to the timeshare from the road. So with this in mind, I kept running, but he's keeping up with me, and this goes on for what feels like 10 to 15 minutes. The scariest part of all this, which I hadn't thought of at the time, was that it was completely dead silent. All I could hear was my breath and my feet on the sand, and when I turned I could only see his shadowy figure up the shore, keeping pace with me. Suddenly, up ahead in the sand, I could see a small blue light and what looked like 4 people on the beach with a blanket. I turned to look at the figure that was chasing me, and bet to myself that even though they are up shore, I can still beat him to these people. So I started sprinting towards them, with hopes of quickly telling them what was going on, so we could all confront him. I really used up my last bit of energy sprinting towards them, and as I approach, my heart drops. What I see is 4 guys on a blanket, with 3 or 4 handles of hard liquor surrounding them. 3 of the handles are empty, and the 4th is about half empty. 3 of the guys are just completely passed out on the blankets, and the last is half sat up, obviously beyond drunk, with a sort of party hat on that has blue lights, and he is talking to himself. His eyes are half closed, and he doesn't even register me approaching him, even though now I'm no more than 5 feet away. I turned again and can see that the figure has slowed down and is just observing me. I can then see that he makes sense of the group's state and suddenly starts sprinting at me again. As he gets closer, the half-passed-out guy's blue light illuminates him, and I can now clearly see it's the same guy as before. I make eye contact with him, and I can see his wide-eyed look is almost maniacal, and he is now barreling towards me in a full sprint. At this point I decided that I really have to do something, and fast. It seemed like I had underestimated his fitness, and since I had just sprinted towards this group and exhausted myself, I was afraid that he might actually be able to catch up to me if we just continued running along the beach indefinitely, and then who knows what. So instead of turning around and running, I suddenly sprint towards him, and to the right, which I don't think he was expecting at all. I caught him off guard and run straight past him, literally in full sprint back to the timeshare, without even looking back. All the hairs on my neck were standing, and it felt like one of those dreams where you're barely evading someone, but he's right about to catch you. The adrenaline was crazy, and it kept me running until I began to be able to see our resort again. I'd finally turned around to see how close he was now, and I could see him in the distance, maybe 400 to 500 feet away. He'd lost a lot of distance on me, and I don't waste any time and sprint up the boardwalk and towards the base of the timeshare. I jammed the elevator buttons, leapt in and started mashing the closed door button as I was gasping for air. The door closed and I hit the button for my floor, and when the elevator reached it, I literally sprint back to my room, open the door, enter, and then slam the door and double lock it behind me. I'm breathing heavily and drop to the floor, just sitting there for a minute, not believing what had just happened. I crouched down and crawled over to my room as I was so afraid that he might be able to see me through the window on our balcony. Let's just say I definitely wasn't able to sleep after that. This story took place about 2 years ago. I was around 16 and 5'6", who either looked like a 12-year-old boy or a 16-year-old tomboy, depending on the person. At the time as well, I suffered with really bad anxiety, and you could definitely see it from my body language, so I was definitely visually an easy target for predators. So I was just picking up some hardbacks for my last year in school, and after I was done shopping, I decided to get a tram back to my dad's workplace, then he would take me home. It was a pretty chilly Sunday morning, and for some reason I had an uneasy feeling. I hated going into town alone, but no one else was available to join me, so I sucked it up and just got on with it. The tram service was new at the time, and I had only taken them 2 or 3 times before, so I was definitely hyper-vigilant on them, especially since I suffer with anxiety. Hyper-vigilant so I didn't miss my stop, and hyper-vigilant that nothing weird happened, as the tram was notorious for weird people. I walked to my stop and waited. I could see the next one was coming soon, but there was a guy nearby that was making me feel unbelievably uneasy. No, I hate assuming the worst of people, but this man was making me so uncomfortable. There was nothing in particular off about him. He just looked a bit scruffy. So I decided to walk away from the stop for a bit and wait for the tram to pass, then return and get the one after. They come often enough, and this dude was giving me the creeps. So I walk away for a bit and take a nice relaxing stroll to calm myself down and return to the stop. But when I get there, he's still there. When I'd left earlier, he definitely watched me go, and so he's obviously waited for me to return. At the time I was doubting myself and told myself I was being irrational. Something like a creepy dude following me couldn't happen to me, surely. Wrong. We got on the tram, and this particular one pulls up at about 5 stops before it gets to my dad's workplace. I walked down the tram a bit, but the man was still in my eye line, and I was in his. Once at my stop, it's about a 5-minute stroll to my dad's work, and it's a quiet area, an area that you'd think someone could easily assault you, kidnap you, and no one would take notice, especially on a Sunday morning. Arriving at each stop, I prayed that this guy got off the tram, but he didn't. My anxiety was through the roof at this point, and although the tram walk is only 5 minutes, I called my dad to pick me up right outside the station. My dad surprisingly obliged. I think he could tell something was off with me. So all I had to do was walk out of the tram station and make it to the car. I still had hope in my heart that this guy would not get off at my station and go to the next instead. My stop came, and I got off. And of course Mr. Creepy got off too. No one else got off but us. The guy looked at me, and I looked at him, and making eye contact I could tell he was planning on walking in my direction and following me. I could see him panic a little though, and then surprisingly and thankfully he walked off in the opposite direction. Now the chilling part about this is, this station only has one exit. This man had turned around, walked onto the tram tracks and just wandered off. I didn't stay too long to see if he would come back, and I sped walk to my dad's car. When I got into my dad's car, I double-checked with him that there was only one exit to the station, as the tram station was new and I was unfamiliar with it. He confirmed that yes, there is only one exit, and that causes me to become covered in goosebumps. This man had waited for me to get onto the tram, even though he could have taken an earlier one, followed me to the station, and decided at the last minute to abort whatever mission he'd had in mind. I have many times tried to rationally explain this to myself. Maybe he wasn't following me at all, and was just a weird dude. But why did his presence make me so uneasy that I decided to walk away and wait for the next tram? Why did he wait for the next tram when he could have gotten an earlier one? What are the chances of the man getting off at the same stop as me? Why did he not use the exit and walk onto the tracks instead? It's not like I gave him a death stare. We just made eye contact when we got off the tram, and I was a 5'6", 16-year-old kid, and definitely not intimidating. All I know about this experience is that I was just glad my dad picked me up outside the station, and I never want to experience the feeling of being followed again. Back when I was attending university, I used to work on campus at one of the dining halls during the dinner night shift. I lived in the next town over, since it was cheaper to live in a crappy little apartment out of town than to live on campus in the dorms. But I didn't own a car, so I had to take the bus. One night I had just gotten off a shift at work. My feet were killing me, and I was completely exhausted. As I slowly made my way to the bus stop, I noticed a man much older than me sitting on one of the two benches at the otherwise empty bus stop. But I didn't pay too much attention to him. I simply sat down on the second bench and listened to some music while waiting for the bus to arrive. The first sign that things were starting to get weird was when I kept noticing out of the corner of my eye that he was staring at me. At first I thought I might be imagining it, so I looked over and caught him quickly turning his head to look away. Okay, so he was staring at me. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary, since being a young college girl seemed to gain me a bit of attention from older men. So as usual, I just ignored him. That was a mistake. Again, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him look at me, but instead of just staring this time, he got up and walked over to sit next to me instead. I continued listening to my music, hoping that he'd see the earbuds and take the hint that I wasn't interested in having a conversation. But instead this man literally took the earbud out of my ear. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said as my head snapped to look at him in shock. I should have told him off for touching my things and demanded he leave me alone, but I was sort of frozen and didn't want to make him mad. Hi," I replied quietly. He started introducing himself as Mike and telling me that he lived in the area and it was always nice to see pretty girls like me at the university bus stop. He explained that he was a real man, unlike the boys I went to school with, and that I should go home with him that night. Now I was a shy, scared virgin who had never had a man be as bold as this to my face. I say to my face because I had certainly gotten my fair share of unsolicited private pictures online by that point, but I digress. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. But that didn't stop Mike from continuing to explain to me all the fun things he wanted to do with me at his place that night. He got into graphic detail. The things he described started out with basic things you'd expect, and escalated to him asking if I liked being choked until I turned purple and passed out in bed. At that moment I wished that there was just anyone else at that bus stop. But it was just the two of us, in the dark, alone, as I counted the seconds until the bus would arrive. Then Mike took things to a different level of shocking by telling me, "Listen, the demons want me to ask for your phone number, and they say you should give it to me, or you won't like what happens." He actually had the audacity to start stroking my hair. His hand was gentle, but I didn't want him touching me at all. This was shocking for a number of reasons. The demons. I wouldn't like what would happen. Why was he touching me? What the hell was this guy talking about? As though he could read my mind, Mike went on to explain. "My therapist knows the demons are real. I told her about them, and she says I'm not crazy, and the demons are real," he laughed, then abruptly stopped. "Now give me your phone number like they said," he demanded, and as his hand stroked my hair for the last time, he stopped and gripped the back of my neck, still gentle, but even more terrifying. I was scared and obviously didn't want him to have my phone number, but he was taking out his phone, and I knew that he was going to call the number I gave him to make sure I wasn't lying to him, and he still had his hand on the back of my neck, so I reluctantly gave him my real phone number. Stupid, I know, but I was right, and he immediately called to check. All I could think about was just not making this guy angry long enough to get away from him, then I'd block his number. Thankfully, the bus came moments later. I sat down as close to the front of the bus near the bus driver as I possibly could, since the bus was basically empty. Mike decided to sit directly across from me. At this point I had tried listening to music again, hoping that being on the bus and him having my phone number would signal to him the end of our conversation. However, he decided to reach over and unzip my sweatshirt, revealing my work shirt and the name tag which I had unfortunately forgotten to remove in my haste to leave work that night. I hadn't told him my name yet. "Abigail, what a beautiful name. Our daughter will be named Celeste." I shouldn't have been shocked at this point, but I was. I had stopped listening to music again and zipped my sweatshirt back up, which made him laugh. "You won't need that soon anyway," he said, and winked at me, implying how he'd planned to undress me even further that night. At one stop, Mike tried to convince me to get off the bus with him. I told him no, that I was tired and just wanted to go home. So he said okay and stayed on the bus. I knew that had been his stop, so the fact that he was staying on the bus worried me. I was sure this meant that he was planning on coming home with me instead. "Baby," Mike whispered to me. I tried to ignore him, but he repeated himself louder. "Baby." He had the most unsettling smile on his face as I asked, "What?" He laughed and told me, "The demons say you smell nice." I was terrified and felt like I was going to throw up by the time my bus stop arrived. I lived in an apartment alone and didn't want him to know where I lived. Despite my body being exhausted and sore from work, adrenaline kicked in and I bolted off the bus and ran straight home. I made it inside and locked the door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see him, so I went to carefully peek out of my window and saw him standing near the bus stop, looking around. He took out his phone, and sure enough I started getting a call from an unknown number, since I hadn't saved his number in my phone. I ignored it, of course, and when he hung up I started getting several texts, asking where I'd gone, how he didn't like hide and seek, and how the demons just wanted to have fun, but I was being a little bitch about it. I was so scared because he knew which apartment building I lived in, where I worked, where I went to school, my phone number and my name. The only good thing which made me feel slightly relieved was that he didn't know which specific apartment number I lived in. And that's when he started yelling outside. There were no specific words said, just wordless yells of what I can only assume were frustration and anger. I blocked his number and kept all the lights in my apartment off as I cried with my back to the front door. Maybe I should have called the police, but my brain was so frazzled that I didn't even think of that until the next day, and by then all I knew about him was that he was mentally unstable, and probably named Mike, who hadn't actually done any physical harm to me, so I didn't think it was worth it. In hindsight, I know that I made a lot of stupid mistakes during this experience. I ended up moving away entirely at the end of that term of school for unrelated reasons, but until then I switched to day shifts at work and was paranoid every night. Thankfully, I never saw that man again. I want to start out by saying that this all happened very quickly and isn't nearly as spooky or scary as 99% of the other stories on here. However, it was a very unsettling experience and one I hope to never have again. I'm a 5'4" trans male, so I'm often paranoid about being out at night and alone. I just moved to a more ritzy suburban gated apartment and have never felt more safe, at least up until that night. I take my dog Sarah on walks fairly late at night, anywhere between 10 p.m. and midnight. She's part pit bull, but she's scared of her own shadow, and I've never gotten the feeling she'd harm anybody, even if they were attempting to harm me. She's a great dog, just definitely not meant to be a guard dog. On this particular evening, it was fairly gross outside as far as air quality and heat. I have asthma, and the air quality bothers me a lot, so it wouldn't be a long drawn-out thing. Sarah had also just had surgery and wasn't quite ready for a full walk due to her meds, so it was perfect. She had a cone on her head as well, which made it fairly difficult to walk and sniff around, since she'd get stuck on bushes or the ground, or me. As per discussion with Sarah, I was only going to head to the apartment mailboxes and grab the mail and head back. Sarah makes this a long drawn-out process anyway, so it would be sufficient considering the air quality and her meds. My significant other was already asleep, so I snuck out of bed, leashed up Sarah and headed out. The way our apartment is set up to get to the mailboxes was a quick walk without Sarah. We are a corner apartment, so on the left is a T-junction that sidelines the parking lot, and to the right is the walk towards the apartment office, which is where the mailboxes are located. The walk was uneventful to the mailbox. Sarah took ages to sniff around and hide behind a tree while I got the mail. On the way back, we were on the final stretch to get back to the apartment and approaching our entryway just before the T-junction. It was about 11:30 p.m, and other folks walk around the complex with their dogs or whatever, so seeing folks isn't uncommon. However, a short distance from our entry, I see a figure wearing a hoodie with the hood up walking down the sidewalk alongside the parking area. While again seeing someone isn't uncommon, seeing someone wearing a hoodie when it's 90+ degrees outside and muggy is a bit odd. The figure had their arms folded and were walking very slowly down that side. They didn't turn down the sidewalk to walk past me, but walked just past it and then paused just at the corner behind a bush right outside my apartment, and then turned to stare at me whilst I walked back to my entryway. They had no dog and made no noise. I couldn't see their face due to the hood being up, and I was already on edge, but when they turned to stare at me with their arms crossed, it creeped me out and alarm bells started to ring. I picked up the pace a bit and finally made it to my entryway. I don't typically lock the front door, which I'm gonna plan on doing from here on out, when I take Sarah on shorter walks, so as soon as I turned the corner and got out of sight of the figure, I busted into a run and grabbed the doorknob. As I turned it, I heard the snap of a twig and crunching noises to my right side, as if someone was running through the landscaping towards my entryway. Me and the dog both dove into the house, and I shut and locked the door as quick as I could. I checked every window which faced that direction, our patio window, our living room windows and bedroom windows, and front door peephole, and could not find the person at all. They must have either kept running up the sidewalk or bolted the other way. I waited a good 15 minutes before taking Sarah back out to relieve herself, in which the person never reappeared. Ever since then, I look everywhere before I leave. We lock the door and I've started going out no later than 10:30 p.m, when more of the residents are out. I no longer have the same feeling of safety here. I always tell my other half when I'm leaving and make sure she's awake. At the time of this story, I was 12 years old. I live in a house with 2 floors in a small village where everyone knew each other, and you knew very quickly if there was a new neighbour or if there was an outside intruder. I had a large garden, and from the upstairs windows you could see into the neighbours' gardens on both sides of the house. One day my friend and I had finished classes earlier than usual and were on our way home. We walked together up to the point where we split paths, and I walked the rest of the way alone. Walking along, I could feel that someone was following me. There's a guy on the opposite side of the road walking along the sidewalk, and he is a good distance from me. Feeling uneasy, I started to walk faster and quickly arrive at the gate to our house, which I unlock as fast as I can. Then I run towards my front door. I get in the house, close the door, double lock it, and run upstairs into the living dining room. I wasn't panicking too much. That is until I could see the man climbing over my gate and coming into the courtyard of my house. At that time it was summer, so windows were open, so I rushed around the house making sure to close them all, on both floors. I could hear the guy whistling and began to panic. I frantically called my mother, but there was no answer, and my father was abroad working. I was alone in a big house with a guy who has followed me home and is now potentially trying to break in. A few minutes later I hear the door slam and the handle moving in all directions. The guy was trying to get in. Me, a 12-year-old girl, was trapped and panicking. I didn't know if at least my neighbours were home, so I could call them for help. But suddenly the noise stopped and I could see the guy coming into my yard. At this point I had forgotten about a path that is close to my house, which leads into a nearby forest, and therefore the gardens of the 3 other houses, including mine. I managed to calm down and go to the kitchen that has a window and French doors that overlook the garden. After a while I decided to cook myself something to eat. When I turn around and the guy is at the edge of my garden, looking at me with a big smile. He is tall and is about to run towards the windows towards my house. But luckily my neighbour, who loved gardening, saw what was happening and yelled at him to get out, otherwise he was calling the cops. The guy left and I went to my neighbour's house in tears. I was never alone in my house again after that, until we moved.